Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here at the Sanford Library. I got to find out why it's called the Sanford Library down. And the book that I've most recently written is this one, Stories from the Mohawk Valley, which mainly deals with Amsterdam history. In fact, since I brought up our books, I'll do the commercial first and then we'll move on to the actual content. I have two books, which if any of you wanted to buy, I'd be most pleased, and so would my friend Miss Audrey, who's up here. The Stories from the Mohawk Valley, a collection of history stories about the Mohawk Valley, $20. This is my pity buy, it's only $5. This book came out 12 years ago. It's called You Can't Go Wrong. And this is the basis on which I can make the claim that I'm sort of Richard Russo light. Years ago, starting for the Troy Record and then for the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, I used to write these allegedly funny satirical columns about life in upstate New York and ran into some of the same problems that Richard Russo does with the hometown crowd, you know, that I'd sold them out. Another columnist for a local paper up in our area, said of me, "Et tu, Bob Cudmore," because I was making fun of Amsterdam. So you can read this book for only $5. And the book that is mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, in Elsewhere, Towards Civic Integrity, Reestablishing the Micropolis. I did not write it, but Judge Vincent DeSantis wrote it, and that book is also available, and it's $15 at the back of the room. How many read the book, Elsewhere, Richard Russo? Okay, I read it too. I should have put my hand up. How many have read Richard Russo novels? Notice my hand did not go up. I hate to say it, it's a terrible thing to say at a library, especially for somebody who actually makes part of his living by writing. I'm not a great book reader. I've never read a Richard Russo novel. I certainly know who Richard Russo is, interviewed him once, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I saw Nobody's Fool in the movies and thought it was wonderful with Paul Newman. But when Joe called about doing this, he kind of put me on the spot. And not only that, he sent me the book. So I read Elsewhere. And honestly, I was just blown away by Elsewhere. I relate to it in many ways. I grew up in Amsterdam, and if you've read the book, you know that a lot of it has to do with Richard's relationship with his mother, Jean. My mother also was a J. Her name was Julia, and maybe somebody here, because I know some of my Amsterdam friends are here, remember my mother, Julia. My mother, and I hate to bring this up, but Rich, at this point, but my mother was kind of unbalanced, but she was not Jean. My mother doted on her son, but she didn't go to college with me. So, anyway, I think I was made for blogging because I always end up talking about myself. I think that one of the reasons I fared better than Richard, although maybe worse, because look at all the material he got out of this, was my father. My father never left, and my father, basically took care of my mother and so on and so forth, but enough about me. Richard Russo was born in 1949. I've got 4 years on him. The judge was born about the same time, 48, and so grew up in the same Gloversville as Richard Russo did. Richard, if you read the book, went away to college with his mother in Arizona, gets a PhD ultimately, starts writing novels based on upstate New York, based on Gloversville, which is where he's raised. Now, the other funny thing is, and I don't know what he means by this, maybe the judge knows, Richard Russo, and even when I interviewed him the one time for like 20 minutes 3 years ago, will tell you he was born in Johnstown, but raised in Gloversville. I mean, Johnstown and Gloversville are like this, but in reality they're like that somehow. But I never could understand that because my friend Audrey, who was from Johnstown, was born in Gloversville because Gloversville is where the hospital is. He must have meant he lived there early on in his first few years, something like that. So anyway, he ends up living on Hellwig Street, which is not a bad street even to this day, I would say. And in fact, another story about Richard Russo, if you haven't seen it, the newspaper I currently write for it, my history columns, is the Daily and Sunday Gazette. And their reporter, Sarah Foss, did a full Sunday feature on Richard Russo and elsewhere. Again, no interview. He wouldn't do an interview with her either. But if you want to see it later, there's a picture of Richard's house, or the house on Helwig Street, where he lived with Jean and with Jean's parents when he was growing up. He goes away to college, starts writing his books. The first is The Risk Pool, 1988. Nobody's Fool, 1993. The movie with Paul Newman comes out in 94. Straight Man, 97. 2001, he wins the Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls. He writes an HBO version of Empire Falls. He wrote other screenplays. The Horus Child, 2002. The classic, or so I'm told, Bridge of Sighs, 2007. 2009, that old Cape Magic, which was the occasion for the interview I did with him 3 years ago. And now, 2013, he puts out Elsewhere. I'm hoping to get from you, and I know I'm doing all the talking right now, sort of what I do, but I will, do want to hear from you, and we're going to hear from the judge, and we're going to hear some of the words of Richard Russo in just a moment. One of the great things about these book discussions, and my Amsterdam friends just had a book discussion about The Shoemaker's Wife on Sunday. I wasn't there, but one of the members of the group that put that together said, always what's so great about getting people together who've read the book is you learn things in the book that you didn't know were there. In other words, I picked up some things about Elsewhere that were important to me, like about my mother and this and that, but I'm sure I've missed tons of things. Here are some of my favorite insights from Elsewhere. When Richard quotes his grandfather as saying, "Whoever said beggars can't be choosers never met your mother." and this line that was delivered to Richard by his father, and honestly, I don't even know his father's name from Elsewhere. Is anybody? Do you know? What's that? He was Jimmy Russo. See, I'm learning things already, because I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he mentions James or Jimmy, or the name in his book. All right, but Richard Russo's, a young man out drinking with his father, which is one of the things his father did really well. And I knew a lot of people in Amsterdam, a lot of people in Gloversville who drank really well, gambled really well, and fooled around really well. And that was what his father did. But his father also worked very hard. And one thing that kind of came through to me, this is an insight without a quote. I mean, the book is dedicated really, or it's about if it's about anything, it seems to me, it's about him and his mother. But he does seem to have a regard for his father. His father was absent, but he would say something like, but if you needed something, you could find him. He'd help you. He'd do something for you. And what I think is one of the signal moments in the book is Richard is sitting next to his father, Jimmy, on a bar stool, and they're both drunk. And Jimmy turns to Richard and says, "You do know your mother's nuts, right?" And I mean, I can imagine, and the way he describes it, he was like a deer in the headlights. He never really had considered that as what was the issue here. He just thought, this was how life was, or this was how his mother was. She had little nerves, and so on and so forth, and we'll fix this, and we'll move on. But there's no fixing it. And I hate to bring back my own experiences. That was true with my mother. I always used to say, my mother is happy when she's sad. She wanted to have, one of her happiest times was when she got breast cancer. Because for one thing, she was the center of attention, and she was a rock. She was a rock, she just took it in stride and did it. But when things were not, well, anyway, I'm too much about myself. Also, and my mother at least didn't have a pet name for me, she called me Bob, but Jean called Richard Russo Rico Mio. And I don't know, I just think that's a great name, Rico Mio. And then toward the end of the book, we have Richard saying, or quoting a conversation he had with his mother, "I just wish you could be happy, Mom. I used to be. I know you don't believe that, but I was." And then at the very end, he says, "To my mother, I owe just about everything." I still work in radio. I do a radio show up in Amsterdam, my hometown, Light 104.7 FM and 1570 AM, WVTL. And you can listen online. We're at WVTLFM.com. I happen to have the mayor of Gloversville on this morning, a man named Dayton King. And he knew we were doing this, and he knows Judge DeSantis very well, thinks the world of the judge, the judge's efforts to revive Gloversville. And he gave me a little quote, I should have maybe tried to save it, in which he said something to the effect about Richard Russo. Well, I've read some of his books, but he's awfully harsh. He's awfully harsh on Gloversville. And he is. And, well, anyway, when I interviewed him 3 years ago, he was plugging that old Cape Magic. It's basically just an interview with Richard, in which he talks about leaving home, leaving Gloversville. And I say to him something to the effect, well, we all wanted to leave, or the place was going downhill. We could see that. We could see that in Amsterdam, which was a rug making capital, and you certainly could see that in Gloversville, where the glove makers really started to flee, rather early on. And Richard says something to the effect, well, yes. He said, when I was growing up, the mantra to all of us growing up was, you got to get out of here. You got to get out of here. And they did get out of here. And he says he runs into people from Gloversville all over the country when he does his book signings. And in fact, they have really gone many places. Is there? And at the end of this interview, and I think this is before he knew of Judge DeSantis, and maybe it's before even Judge DeSantis wrote his book, I say, well, do you think there's hope for our region? And our region is not so much here, Colonie and Albany and Troy and even Schenectady, but Gloversville, Johnstown, Amsterdam. There's something we can do? I mean, we tend to dwell. We're like Southerners in a way. After the Civil War, we dwell on the past. All our happiness is in the past. And he said something I thought, in light of his current book and some of the controversies about it, about him being harsh. He said, I really don't feel qualified to talk about what Gloversville should do, because I have not been there very much. And in fact, switching to another interview, which I heard recently, the great Joe Donahue on WAMC did get an interview with Richard Russo. I think they have a long-standing kind of personal relationship. So I think one of the few interviews that Russo did for elsewhere was done on WAMC. And listening to it, I certainly got the impression, I don't know if any of you heard it, that Russo has not been back specifically to Gloversville by design. I mean, he's almost afraid to go there. He's been to Johnstown, which is the next town over, but still like maybe kind of a world apart. But as for going to Gloversville, he just hasn't done it. And another point and I'd like to make, and then ask the judge about it, because I'm not really sure what the judge's opinion is. Are you folks familiar with how Judge DeSantis comes into the book? It's sort of toward the end of the book. Richard's writing elsewhere, and he gets a package from Gloversville and Judge DeSantis. And at first he goes, oh, crying out loud, what's this? And it's, it's sort of you can tell it's like a book, and maybe he tosses it aside. Eventually he opens it, and it's that book, about reestablishing the micropolis. And at first he's very dismissive of what the judge has to say, and then the judge, I'll let the judge say what he has to say, but it's basically about renewal, revival of small towns or small cities like Gloversville. But eventually, I think it seems to me, Richard's conclusion is, well, maybe that's fine for Judge DeSantis and the people of Gloversville, but I just don't think I can be part of that. And also, it seems to me that Richard has a somewhat different view of the past in Gloversville than, well, I don't even know if the judge has, than I would say that I have. Because I'm sort of one of those people who remembers the good old days as the good old days. Now, maybe Amsterdam was significantly different in some way from Gloversville. They're both mill towns, but somehow I get the impression that the glove-making industry was exceptionally hard on the people. the carpet industry, yeah, also. But like my father worked in the carpet mills, most of his life, and he lived to be 85. He wasn't sick, he didn't get cancer. He was paid relatively well because he had one of the top skilled jobs. He was a weaver of Wilton carpet. But some of Richard Russo's relatives, his cousin that he mentions in the book, his grandfather with whom he and his mother Jean lived, they worked in these what they called skin mills, where they would tan the hides for making gloves, and they became sick and they were exploited. And even though Richard appreciated that Gloversville was vibrant and full of life, and there was the Glove Theater and the Shine movie chain was based there, and there were restaurants like Pedrick's, and it was you couldn't cross downtown without running into throngs of people. I think somewhere in one of the reviews I read that Richard has, both in Elsewhere and in his novels, and of course you who read the novels maybe would have an opinion on this, he has a great sense of moral outrage over what was done to the people by industry. So with that pleasant introduction, maybe I'll ask the judge to come up for a moment. I think we can each have a seat. This worthless little tape recorder here, I don't know. Maybe it's the wrong interview. So I'll tell you what, why don't you sit down there, and we'll share this microphone. We have a hand for Judge DeSantis here.
Thank you.
So, what do you think? I mean, have you ever talked to Richard?
Never spoke to him. And even though we were contemporaries in the same city, he went to the Catholic high school, and I went to public high school. I went to Gloversville High. So we never knew each other, even though we were in high school at the same time. And to this day, I haven't spoken to him, but I did write to him. I got his address in Maine from his cousin, Greg. And after he wrote that Granta article in that London magazine about Gloversville, I was apprised of it by someone else. And I wrote him a letter refuting his points, his view of Gloversville's past to a certain extent. And he wrote back to me, and we corresponded back and forth by regular mail, maybe 3 or 4 rounds of discourse. It was very cordial and mutually respectful. But we sort of left off with kind of the idea that we had different jobs. His job, he said, was really fiction and talking about the past, and it was a flight of imagination, and my job was the future and making the future of Gloversville. So our positions were very different, and therefore our point of view had to be very different. But I recently read Elsewhere, and I think that Mayor King is right. He's very harsh to Gloversville. And so I think I owe him another letter. I think I'm going to have to send him another letter and sort of maybe go back and forth a couple more times.
How did you find out that you were in Elsewhere?
Well, I just retired from the bench at the end of 2011, and I was in Europe almost all of 2012. And I got an email from some friends saying that Richard Russo wrote a new book. It's a memoir, and you are mentioned in it many times. And so I kept that in the back of my head, and as soon as I got back to the States, I started reading it.
What is your point of view? If Richard, it's correct to say, and again, this is somebody saying it of him, that he has great moral outrage about the glove industry and so forth.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with him? Do you think it was not an exploitative industry?
It's my feeling that, and I'm very strong on this because I'm a student of history. I've always loved history. And it's my feeling that industrial society in the 19th and most of the 20th century has been a very violent process. All of industrial society, not just Gloversville and not just the tanning industry, but the coal miners in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, the people who work in slaughterhouses in North Carolina, the working class, unskilled laborers have been exploited in industrial society throughout history. And so Gloversville is not alone and should not be singled out for this contempt. And the other thing that I want to mention is that there are certain things that he mentions in Elsewhere about Gloversville and the glove industry which are false. One of the things that he mentions is that, and I don't want to quote it exactly, but he says that the cancer rate is off the actuarial charts in Gloversville. Well, because I read that, I went online to the National Cancer Institute, and I got the cancer rates, and Fulton County's cancer rate is no different than the cancer rate anywhere else in the United States. The other thing he mentioned is that his grandfather did not work in a tannery. He worked making gloves, a very different occupation. My father, all my uncles were glove makers. Both my grandfathers were glove cutters. They worked with finished leather making gloves. His grandfather worked on the top floor of a building, and my father always said it was a really nice, clean occupation. And so the tanning industry is a very different thing. They're tanning the raw hides of animals, the skins of animals. So it's dirty, there's chemicals involved, it's not a skilled occupation, so it's a whole different milieu. Today, leather is still manufactured in Fulton County. Gloves are not manufactured. The glove industry is what went overseas. Making fine dress gloves is what went overseas. And he also says in his book that glove cutters and glove makers were underpaid. They made meager salaries. And I have to tell you that my father is 92 years old, and I sat down with him, it must have been a year and a half ago, and I said, Dad, how much money did you make as a glove cutter in the mid-50s, 1954, 1955? And he said, I would generally bring home probably a little less than $100 a week. And he said, but I was a fast cutter. Most cutters generally would bring home about $75, $80 a week. And we sat down and we figured out how much everything cost in 1955 and how much it costs today. How much did you pay for your house in 1953? How much did you pay for a car back then? How much was a loaf of bread? How much was a pound of hamburger? And we figured out that $90, $100 a week would buy what $1,300 a week would buy today. Now, he said the average glove maker was making maybe $50 or $60 a week. So you have to think about a city where, and this is a fact, 13,000 people out of 25,000 were employed in the glove industry or related industries. 13,000 people employed with an average salary, comparing today, of about $600 a week. Think of what a city would be like when people are making that kind of money. Everybody. Because that 13,000 people, more than half the population, does not include butchers and grocers and teachers and firemen and policemen and bankers and all of those people. So we're talking about full employment at a decent living wage where people could buy a house, a car, and have a vacation and that type of thing. So his view of Gloversville in the 1950s, in my view, after reading Elsewhere, is looked at through the lens of his emotionally disturbed mother, and also through the lens of the exaggerations and of his cousin. His cousin Greg is talking about all of these horrible accidents that happen in tanneries where people lose their hands and that type of thing. I'm sure there are industrial accidents. I don't doubt that some of those were true, but they're picked out as sensational things to convey. And Richard Russo, who's never been back to Gloversville, is taking all this in and painting a picture of this terribly decrepit, horrible place. And so he goes to Phoenix with his mom, and she says, "What an awful, awful place." And then he goes to Illinois with his mom, and she says, "What an awful, awful place." And then he's in Maine, in Waterville, Maine, with his mom, and she says the same thing. So,
Well, anyway, let me try to stick up for Richard, I guess, and I don't know if anybody else wants to. Again, not having read his books, but having read elsewhere. But the skin mills were bad.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Yeah. And I thought his grandfather worked in the skin mills. The guy that's living in the house on Hellwig Street?
Right. No. In Elsewhere, he talks about his mother pointing to the top floor of a glove making, and his father was working there on the top floor, and he says, "high and dry." And she was proud of him working up there. My grandfather used to go to work with a white shirt and a tie because they were skilled laborers.
Well, that was true in Amsterdam. I always felt privileged, or years later I felt privileged because my father was a weaver. They dressed the part. They did dirty kind of work, but they were on a level where they worked piecework and they could make, kind of like what you're describing with, I think, your own father. But in doing some other projects like about Amsterdam history, like this documentary we did called Carpet City, and just talking to people, who also worked in the mills. For example, the women who worked in the carpet mills tended to be at the lower end of the scale. They were the winding the bobbins. It was tedious, demanding work. And the carpet mills didn't have skin mills, but they did have the dye house. And I remember talking with my father's old union boss, Tony Merdico, from the Textile Workers Union of America, and he had this rough, gravelly voice from the south of Italy, and he said something like, "Everybody hated to work in the dye house, everybody." And it was just kind of reminded me what the skin mills were like. And in all honesty, I don't know. I didn't work there. Did you?
Yes. I worked in a skin mill. When I was in college, my father decided that I would have a lot more incentive at school if I worked a summer in a skin mill. And so the summer of 1969, I worked at not Independent Leather, it was Twin City Leather on South Main Street in Gloversville. And it was on the wet floor of the skin mill at $2 an hour. And it was really an experience. Both my brother and I worked there. And I can remember the older guys there used to pick on us all the time because, and at the end of the summer they said, "You guys are the first hippies that have ever worked the whole summer." He said, and so my brother said, "The only reason we're here is because my father would kill us if we quit."
and to Richard's credit, he didn't work in the mills, but he did work with his father. Sounds like, construction. And
construction.
And again, his father, I think on a good day, I wrote some of this other stuff down about the mother, maybe get that in a moment, but I don't know if you would agree, it seems to me that his father on a good day was probably Sully in Nobody's Fool,
Could be, yeah.
the character Sully. And Richard was asked about his mother, let me see here, and he told the New York Times, Anne Grouse in Mohawk, anybody know Anne Grouse, Mohawk? Well, anyway, is my mother on a good day. Brave, faithful, lovely, determined. Ned Hall's mother in the Risk Pool, anybody? Is the same woman on those days when the demons closed in, unhinged, terrified, needy, and ill. One other point to bounce off the judge about the mother, Jean, she worked at GE, which, as I was growing up, was always the top of the line for working. Like, Amsterdam was closer to Schenectady and GE than Gloversville. And I remember my father got a job at GE in the 1920s. And then he was laid off in the Depression and ended up going to work in the carpet mills. And again, showing some of the issues in Amsterdam. My family is of English origin. My father was born in England. We were not part of the English people who owned the mills, but we were English. And I remember when my father was in the nursing home, asking him, I said, Dad, one thing's always puzzled me. How is it that when you got laid off at GE, you were able to get a job at Mohawk Carpet in the Depression? Because I'm English. And that was how things were done in those days. It's like that in the glove mills?
I don't think so. Glove manufacturing is a very different thing than any kind of line manufacturing. It always depended on the skill of the glove cutter and the glove maker to make a quality product. So it was always this craftsman-like industry. It never really got away from that. And so when the glove industry, after the Civil War, when the glove industry started to expand in Gloversville, it was really Jewish people who came up from New York City to Gloversville and brought with them the Europeans, French, Italian glove makers from Europe who had that skill to make fine dress gloves. So they were really, really concentrating on the skill of being able to make these gloves of high quality that would compete with gloves made in Europe. And so they were more focused on that than ethnicity.
And it's interesting, I know you said you're into history. I really haven't done much with Gloversville, but I have read in Barbara McMartin's book on the glove industry, and also Professor Zahavi, Jerry Zahavi, over to SUNY Albany, is kind of an authority on the labor history. And I think one of his books, or somebody's books, is called The Shtetl in the Adirondacks.
Yes.
I mean, it was really remarkable that so many Jews moved to Gloversville because apparently glove cutting was one of the professions or trades open to Jews that they could apply over in Europe. And also, as you say, all these glove cutters were individual. I mean, probably it'd be very difficult for Tony Merdico to organize them into a 5,000-member union local, right? I mean, they sort of looked out for themselves.
Well, no, there were unions. There were unions in Gloversville, but there was always a personal relationship between the owner of the factory and his cutters, and the owner and the makers. There was always they were almost kind of on a first name basis. So there wasn't that dichotomy that you see in a lot of industries, and it never developed into one of those mass production type of industries.
Well, anyway, do appreciate it. And to stay right there, Judge, because it just occurs to me that maybe we should ask people what they think. Do you have any more comments on elsewhere? I think we've kind of gone perhaps farther afield, talking about industry and the glove industry and the carpet industry. The judge did mention that Richard seeing Gloversville through the eyes of his mentally disturbed mother, and that is another very, kind of Gloversville and upstate New York aside, I found that a very compelling part of the book. The end of her life, maybe even after she's died, he thinks to himself, well, my God, she was sick. We could have maybe done something about that. And apparently he believes that she had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and one of his children has apparently has that kind of issue. And how about this? I'll address this mainly to the ladies. How about Mrs. Russo? Barbara Russo, let's give her a round of applause with his mother-in-law that's followed them all over the country. And she kind of put up with that or and lived with that. I mean, how did that happen? Yes, ma'am.
Well, first I want to say my grandmother was a glove fiend.
Your grandmother was a...
She collected gloves.
Okay.
I collect eyeglasses. Yes, I need them. But I still have gloves of hers that were made in Gloversville. And it says made in, Gloversville. I have a lot of them. That my grandmother's been, I don't know, my father's 93, so you can figure out how old my grandmother was. But what I have to say, and by the way, these gloves have not dried out. They are, I could still wear them, but I wouldn't dare. In terms of Memoir, I knew Sandy Roth, Philip Roth's brother, very well. I worked for him. And when Patrimony came out, I read it, and I said, is something not right about this? And I was right. And I called Sandy, because he was still alive at the time. And that's when I began to realize, I was not a big memoir reader, but I started reading memoirs. I even took a class in it. And what you learn from memoir is that there's less here than meets the eye. And I love Richard Russo, but I don't like I don't like what is done to it. It's always seen, there's always an overlay. Don't forget, like Judge DeSantis said, he's a novelist. He writes fiction. You're not going to get all the truth, and you're not going to get it. It's always going to be filtered. And the question you always have to ask, even if you read the book, you know, do it is how crazy really was she? Okay? Was she as crazy as he makes her out to be? Or is this seen through the eyes of a young man whose mother went to college with him? Maybe she just liked the weather. Maybe it was her way of getting her, and she figures, all right, I'll go over there.
Yes.
But the thing is, you got to really be careful when you read it,
Sure.
and then just say, well, okay.
Well, I obviously buy into it a lot more than you do. For example, I was telling Audrey on the way over about some of his lines when he was talking about when they were going to Phoenix, or I think it wasn't the school in Tucson. I kind of get this mixed up.
The school was in Tucson.
In Tucson, but she led him to believe, and of course, you know, we're going on his word, that she had a job. You know, she was going out to GE but she was with GE and she had a job. There was no job, you know. And at some point, and one of her many times going, or I don't know if it was many, or several times going back to Gloversville, she said, now listen, I've not been defeated. I'm only going back to Gloversville because my father's sick. And, you know, Richard, his thought was, well, she has been defeated. You know, she went out there, couldn't find a job, got married, got divorced, and, you know, she's coming back. What can you do? And his mother, he said, never cared if you believed what she said, as long as you didn't contradict her in public. And I don't know, I just taken in by a lot of that stuff. But I appreciate that. Yes, ma'am.
Soon after the publication of Risk Pool, Richard Russo spoke at the main library downtown, and it was a huge
Did they record it, by the way? No, I'm sorry.
I really don't know. It was a huge room, and it was filled. And it was filled with many people from Gloversville who had come down especially to hear him. And in the question and answer part, they would say things like, well, was Phil's Tavern really Bill's Tavern?
Right,
and he'd say yes. And he seemed so delighted to see him, and I could just feel the love in that room. And then when I read this book, I was totally amazed. It didn't seem the same, because in Risk Pool, no matter what he says about the town, you have the feeling that he did have affection for it. And it was a beautiful description of a small town. I mean, I knew it because my parents had moved to Corning, and I think it was around the same size.
Yep. Well, I tell you, it's interesting. I want to get the judge's view on this, but my friends from Amsterdam may make the same connection. I think Richard Russo, to some extent, is like Amsterdam's Kirk Douglas. You know, maybe some of Kirk's relatives are in the room here, I don't know. Are there any relatives? I have to be careful what I say. But anyway, I'm a great Kirk fan from Amsterdam. My father grew up on Eagle Street where Kirk Douglas lived, and my mother knew his family and so on and so forth. But he's very controversial. He wasn't, you know, when he was the movies, Kirk Douglas. But then when he put out, not a memoir, but his autobiography, Ragman's Son, I would say two basic things in that offended people in Amsterdam. He said Amsterdam was anti-Semitic. Well, I mean, I'm not Jewish, but it seems to me there's a certain amount of truth to that. But people did not, you know, other people don't think so, and that he was wrong to bring that up, and he dragged the name of his hometown through the mud. And the other thing he did was literally drag through the mud the name of a well-known educator in Amsterdam with whom he had an affair. and that kind of offended a lot of people. So ever since then, it's sort of been like kind of back and forth. I don't think, he's very old now, and I think the last time he came back with, and maybe the last time he was really kind of universally popular in Amsterdam was, I believe it was 1984 when he came back for Kirk Douglas Day. So I guess what I'm leading up to, you don't have to actually answer this, but what is the reaction of Gloversville people in general to Richard?
I agree with you that when you read his novels, there is an undertone of affection there, even though a lot of what he says is disparaging about the old mill town, kind of the Rust Belt place, or a declining industrial place, or but he has that underlying. It's almost like a Garrison Keillor type of thing, where there's this, you're making fun of your town, but there's this affection for it. There's this beauty there, and it's reflected in the beauty of the characters. And so I always thought, I never took offense to any of the things that he wrote in his novels. It was. And so I always thought, and I still think even today, there's something within Richard Russo that really wants to love Gloversville, and he won't allow himself to do that.
Very good.
Because one of the things that he says, I think there was a Leader Herald reporter that interviewed him and wrote an article, and he emailed me the article, and he said, what if I go back to Gloversville and it turns off the creative faucet for me? What if I go back and I see Gloversville differently and I'm not able to write anymore?
True. Okay, yes, ma'am.
I saw him at the State University several years ago, and I loved him then, and I loved his books, and there were people from Gloversville there who loved him. And when I read this book, I felt awful. I felt, why did he write it? I got a different feeling for him to do that to his mother. I felt that it wasn't necessary for him to write that book.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
I felt like he wrote it to come to terms with his relationship with his mother and maybe with Gloversville too. And I think he does love Gloversville, as I think he truly loved his mother. But there were parts of her and parts of where he grew up, and the whole thing of coming from a family where your parents weren't intact, it wasn't an intact family. There was all these other things that were going on in his life, and that's why I think he wrote the book. I don't think he meant to be hurtful toward anyone, not Gloversville nor his mother, but it was just sort of a release for him, maybe.
Okay. Other folks here? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
How did he finally forgive?
I'm sorry?
How did he finally forgive his mother?
How did he?
Finally forgive her?
I'm sorry, still not getting it.
I think.
What did she say?
She said, how did he finally forgive his mother?
Okay.
I don't think he ever was indicting of his mother. I don't think at any point in his life, even though he pokes fun at the things that she says and does. And I agree with you that if someone else were to write this memoir from a different point of view, you might get a completely different story. Because it's easy to pick out these crazy times when his mother was crazy. But I think that I agree with Patty, he really loves his mother. And at the end, he's wondering, gee, if I'd known she had OCD, I could have done more to maybe make her happy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
because he didn't know at the time, see?
Don't you think it's partly, maybe he's a little ashamed that he didn't realize it?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I used this at the beginning, with the insights from the book. Practically the very last thing. To my mother, I owe, well, just about everything. I mean, I think he realizes his mother, and if my mother's listening, I think I owe everything to you too. But, are we supposed to be done, Joe? Or?
Unless people have questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of like American Pastoral. Did you read that?
Oh, yeah.
It's time
Philip
for-
Roth, and he talks about Newark, New
Oh,
Jersey.
yeah, American Pastoral. Yeah, I read that. That was, I enjoyed that book too, yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, again, I don't know if I'm Richard's great defender because I haven't read any of the books. I kind of wish I did because I just read Elsewhere and I thought that was great. But I'm really getting a sense from a number of you that you don't like Elsewhere as much as you like the novels. Yes, sir.
I never read any of his books or anything, but I'm just curious. Did he have any brothers or sisters?
No,
or was he
Apparently not. No, he was an only child.
That's why she followed.
Yeah.
That could have been some problem too.
And she called him Rico Mio.
You know, an only child plus his father, you know, distant.
Yep.
So you had two things together. And also what you said about, I grew up in Amsterdam, so what you said about Gloversville being prosperous, from what I'd heard during the Depression, Gloversville never knew there was a Depression.
Right, that's true.
It was after the Second World
Yeah,
War.
we never knew.
Things started changing.
As a matter of fact, in the 70s, when I first started practicing law in Gloversville, I remember people saying, we just had our depression 40 years late.
John.
Historically, we were just getting to it, I think. When did the glove industry depart Gloversville and the carpet industry Amsterdam?
Well, again, I don't know anything about Gloversville. I asked the judge after I give an opinion, even though I don't know anything. The carpet industry, I do know. That was after World War II. It left in a much more dramatic way, I think, than the glove industry left Gloversville and Johnstown. 1955, there were two main carpet mills in Amsterdam, Bigelow Sanford and Mohawk. Bigelow Sanford moved out lock, stock, and barrel 1955. Mohawk became Mohasco and stayed, and kind of, it was like a retreat. The head of it was a former soldier, Herbert Shuttleworth, and it was almost to me like, I think he did kind of a favor for the city. He pulled out gradually. They basically moved south. Much of it now they've moved offshore. The places they moved to in Georgia are now abandoned by the carpet industry. But so it was a much more dramatic kind of turn of events. I remember my father worked in the carpet mill until the end of production in Amsterdam, in carpet production, which was 1968. I even remember the year. You know, they stopped making carpet that year. I got the impression from Barbara McMartin, despite what she said about, you know, the Gloversville didn't know there was a depression, that the glove industry really kind of decided to leave even earlier, like in the 19-teens or 1920s.
No, that was really the 19-teens and the 1920s were the real boom times of the glove industry. It started to decline in the 1950s very gradually, where glove makers were starting to manufacture in the Philippines. I can remember one uncle was sent to the Philippines to train people how to make and sew gloves by Grando Glove Company. So it sort of, and it was a very gradual decline through the 50s. And then in 1960, when President Kennedy was elected, the inauguration in 1961, Jacqueline Kennedy wore leather gloves. Mm-hmm. And she wore leather gloves when she appeared in public on many occasions, and the whole city of Gloversville just went into high gear immediately because there was a tremendous demand for ladies' dress gloves. And so in the early 1960s, for a couple of years, it was back to the glory times again. But then, of course, the decline continued after that.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
In the 1950s, when they started shipping gloves overseas to be sewn, there was a large workforce of women who worked at home.
Yes.
And they were relatively independent, but when they no longer had that income at home, they had no income.
Yeah, that's true. My mother sewed gloves at home.
And the school had a department in the public school that taught girls to stitch gloves.
Are you from Gloversville?
Since 1951.
Yeah, that's true. I can remember when I was in school, they still had glove making classes in middle school.
And my husband was from Gloversville. He would tell me that in the beginning of the 60s, and he told me that they were still teaching people how to sew gloves then.
Right.
Okay, well, Mr. Joe, I don't want to overstay our welcome.
No more questions.
Okay, I guess we'll wrap it up then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.